It was an ordinary morning at Terminal C of Redmond International Airport, Holyoke, Ohio. The kind of morning that starts with stale coffee, hurried footsteps, and endless lines. For Thatcher Malin, an airport security veteran with more than 20 years of service and a back that had been complaining since 6 o'clock, it was just another shift like any other. He paced the lobby with Bishop, his four-legged companion, a Belgian shepherd with a restless gaze and an unbeatable sense of smell. Bishop wasn't just a canine dog, he was practically Thatcher's shadow, the only constant since he'd left the army years before. Their routine was precise, almost choreographed: monitoring, random inspections, behavioral observation. Nothing caught them by surprise, at least not until that day. Before continuing, take advantage and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss stories like this. Real, intense, and thought-provoking. That was when Bishop stopped walking. He stopped in front of a tall, blonde woman who stood too carefully for someone who was nearly 9 months pregnant. She was holding 2 paper bags, her hands pressed against her belly, as if she were trying to protect something. She was wearing a navy blue coat that looked too heavy for the season and big sunglasses, as if she wanted to disappear into the crowd. Thatcher was only a few feet away when he saw her knees give way. The bags fell, spilling their carefully packed contents. Fruit, a bottle of juice, and something that gleamed in the artificial light, a military dog tag. Even before he got close, he knew this was no coincidence, and for the first time in years, the past slammed into his door with the force of a punch to the gut. The commotion around her was immediate. Passengers began to gather, but Thatcher acted quickly. He crouched down beside the woman, checking for a pulse, breathing, signs of trauma. Sweat dripped down her forehead even in the cold air conditioning of the terminal. She was mumbling something incomprehensible, her half-closed eyes slowly rolling as if she were caught between 2 states of consciousness. Bishop was glued to her. He sniffed intensely, as if there was something there that he could not explain, a smell that made no sense, but that awakened all his instincts. When Thatcher moved a lock of the woman's hair to get a better look at her face, he froze for a moment, not because of her appearance per se, but because of a detail that was impossible to ignore. The necklace. It was not a replica nor an ornament. It was a real military dog tag with the name Hollis Rare engraved in worn letters, and Thatcher knew that name better than she cared to remember. Hollis had been his unit mate in Afghanistan, someone with whom he had shared foxholes, food supplies, and silences that were too long for 2 soldiers so young. But Hollis was dead, presumably, of course. The body had never been found, only a brief report, sealed with an official stamp, and the folded flag handed to a woman Thatcher had never met. And now, 2 decades later, that name was hanging around the neck of a pregnant stranger who had just passed out in the middle of a commercial airport. Thatcher felt a chill run down his spine, something that even years of service could not neutralize. He picked up the necklace carefully, almost as if touching a ghost, and looked around. He had to get her out of there, not out of protocol, but out of instinct. And because, deep down, he already knew nothing about this scene was a coincidence. Thatcher led Marlowe to the terminal's medical support room, where a rookie paramedic tried to hide his nervousness as he monitored her vital signs. Her pulse was racing but steady. Her blood pressure was high. She was sweating profusely and her fingers were trembling slightly, signs that could indicate dehydration, stress, or something deeper. Bishop, meanwhile, stood in the doorway like a sentry, his eyes alert, scanning the air as if he were waiting for something or someone to appear. Thatcher stepped back and pulled out his phone, opening an old contact he hadn't used in years. Cassandra Voss, the name on the screen said. She was all that remained of an informal network of veterans who helped each other when the system failed. He hadn't thought about her in a while, but he knew if anyone would understand what was going on, it would be her. While she waited for the call to be returned, she returned to the living room. Marlowe had woken up. Her eyes were open, but there was something strange about them. It wasn't confusion or pain, it was focus, as if she knew exactly where she was, but was scanning the room instinctively. When their eyes met, she spoke before Thatcher could even speak. "You know that name, don't you? Hollis." Her voice was steady, but it carried an unnerving lilt to it, a certainty that didn't suit someone who had just fainted in public. Thatcher approached slowly, trying to remain calm. "Where did you get that necklace?" she asked. She took a deep breath, as if trying to pull up memories from a place that wasn't yet accessible. "He left it to me when I was little. He said I'd understand someday." The sentence sounded rehearsed, but her eyes said something else, as if even she was surprised by what she'd just said. Thatcher pulled up a chair, sat across from her, and rested his elbows on his knees, the necklace still clasped between his fingers. He wasn't sure exactly what he was feeling, a mixture of distrust, alarm, and a strange form of déjà vu. It was like reliving a chapter he'd sworn he'd buried. "Do you know who Hollis was to me?" he asked, his tone lower now. Marlowe shook her head slowly. "My mother used to tell me about him sometimes. She said he was a good man, that he left me a gift before he left." Her voice wavered between memory and uncertainty, as if she were repeating words she'd heard many times before, but now they were beginning to take on new weight. Thatcher shifted in his chair and looked at the young woman more closely. "Your mother. What was her name?" The answer came almost automatically. Lena Ashford. And with that, everything inside froze. Lena. The name sank into Thatcher's mind like lead. He remembered her vaguely, an Afghan translator, fluent in 6 languages, who worked with special units during reconnaissance missions, discreet, efficient, invisible, always one step behind the soldiers, but with a look that took in everything. There were rumors that she had been involved with someone in the army, but that was common, nothing official, nothing that would go into the reports. Now it all seemed to make sense. "She raised you alone?" he asked. Marlowe nodded. "We moved from city to city all the time. We never stayed in the same place for more than 6 months, and she never let me use the internet or a cell phone. She said it was dangerous." Outwardly, Thatcher remained in control. Inside, the pieces were beginning to fall into place uncomfortably. This woman had been on the run, and now, for some reason, here she was, unconscious in the middle of an airport, carrying a military collar and a baby about to be born. Outside the room, Thatcher's phone vibrated. It was Cassandra. He answered with a "Need you in Red Hollow. Now," without waiting for confirmation. Cassandra Voss was not a woman to ask unnecessary questions. A former field agent, cold as steel, and with a visual memory that bordered on the absurd, she had retired from active duty years before after a poorly explained operation in Prague. Since then, she had disappeared from the radar. Until today. Thatcher hung up, returned to the room, and found Marlowe staring at Bishop, as if the dog were saying something that only she understood. "He's not uncomfortable with me," she commented almost in a whisper. "Usually they get agitated, but he seems to know me." Thatcher raised her eyebrows, not sure if this was a coincidence or another one of those moments that make reality seem distorted. And the worst, Bishop was also strange. He stayed close, but not alert. It was as if he had already accepted Marlowe as part of the team. The next few minutes were filled with the silence of someone who needs to wait for something to happen, but feels like they're already late. When Cassandra finally showed up, she was wearing a worn grey overcoat and had an expression that was a mix of tiredness and readiness. "How long has it been since you called me for something like this?" she asked, before even greeting him. Thatcher led her to Marlowe without beating around the bush. Cassandra stopped when she saw her. Her eyes traveled every inch of the young woman's face, and attention filled the room. "How old are you?" she asked. 23. I'll be 24 in October." Cassandra nodded slowly. "And your mother, Lena, when was the last time you saw her?" Marlowe took a deep breath. "She died 2 months ago. Cancer. She left a box with letters and papers that I haven't even had the courage to open yet." Thatcher and Cassandra exchanged a silent look, the kind that holds more history than any explanation could cover. Marlowe opened the bag slowly, as if she knew what was inside would change everything, even if she wasn't yet aware of exactly what. From there, he took out a dark wooden box, with small carvings on the sides that looked like symbols, but were too worn to decipher. Inside it was a stack of envelopes tied with linen thread, some torn at the edges, others sealed, as if waiting for a specific occasion. At the top, a sheet of paper folded in four, with a single sentence written in blue ink. "If something ever happens to me, follow the sound of your memories." Cassandra took the paper and analyzed it as if she were faced with a familiar puzzle. "Your mother was brilliant," he murmured, "and paranoid to the same degree. This here is code." She hid messages between the lines. As Marlowe watched, Thatcher opened one of the envelopes. Inside was an old photograph, 3 men in uniform, laughing in front of a military helicopter with the sun rising behind them. On the back, an inscription faded by time, but still legible: Helix Base, Bravo Sector, 2001. Beside the photo, a sheet of paper filled with seemingly random numbers, but not to Cassandra. She took the paper and scanned it with the precision of someone who has deciphered too many secrets in her life. This isn't a serial number or a troop. Code. It's a coordinate, geolocation. And if Lena left this for her, it's because she wanted her to go after it. Marlowe remained silent, but an unsettling feeling was growing inside her. Something there made sense, a kind of visceral connection that didn't come from reason, but from within, as if parts of her body already knew the way. "Why would I feel all this for things I've never experienced?" she asked quietly. No one answered, but the faces around her made it clear. She wasn't imagining it. Over the next few days, Marlowe felt as if she were being pulled by something invisible. Little flashes would come at random moments, a song on the radio that would trigger memories that weren't hers, the smell of grease coming from a bus that would make her stomach churn, or even the sound of helicopters passing in the distance that would make her close her eyes involuntarily. Thatcher and Cassandra followed each change cautiously, as if they were treading an emotional minefield. Bishop, for his part, became even more protective. He slept next to her on the couch in their makeshift accommodation and reacted to any sudden approach as if he were trained to protect her. One of those nights, when everyone had fallen silent, Marlowe woke up sweating, her chest heaving. She had dreamed of snow, but that wasn't all. There was a facility surrounded by high fences, a frayed American flag, and a man in a white lab coat with sad eyes who kept repeating her name as if begging for forgiveness. At tea, breakfast the next morning, Marlowe told them everything. She detailed the dream with surgical precision, citing the names of corridors, symbols on the doors, and even room numbers. Thatcher and Cassandra looked at each other in silence. The place she was describing existed, or at least it had existed. It was one of the facilities classified as inactive after one of the most controversial projects of the early 2000s, Project Helix. Cassandra took a deep breath and dropped the bombshell she had avoided saying out loud until then. "Marlowe, you're not just the daughter of a missing soldier. You were created inside an experiment, something that should not have happened." The silence that followed was like shattered glass. Marlowe looked at the two of them, then at Bishop, who was now lying with his head between his paws, attentive. "So everything I felt until today wasn't madness?" Thatcher replied calmly but firmly, "No, it was programming." Marlowe didn't cry or scream. She just stood there, her eyes fixed on an invisible point on the wall, as if she had to reorganize her entire existence in seconds. "Did you know?" she asked, without raising her voice. Thatcher shook her head. "We knew something was wrong with the project, but we never saw any of the children. They said they had been relocated, that they were fine." Cassandra added, "That was a lie. When the program was shut down, there was a fire at the main base. Official records said everything was destroyed. But anyone who knows the system knows nothing is destroyed, only relocated." Marlowe leaned back in her chair, taking a deep breath. "So, If I was created, there are others. The sentence wasn't a question, it was an observation. Thatcher nodded. Probably, but we don't know how many or where. It was the first time she trembled, not with fear, but with responsibility. It was as if, now that she knew the truth, a part of her felt obligated to see it through to the end. That same night, Marlowe decided to open the other envelopes left by her mother. Each letter seemed to have been written at different times, as if Lena knew that her daughter would not be ready for everything at once. In one of them, a passage caught my attention. You were made to resist, not to obey. Your mind is your most powerful weapon, and if one day you find someone who also dreams of you, don't run away. Protect them. Marlowe reread those words 10 times. Kane. She didn't know why, but that name, which she hadn't yet recognized, began to vibrate in some corner of her mind. And then came the first vivid dream. A snowy field. A boy alone, sitting on a wooden porch, drawing circles in the dirt with a piece of charcoal. She woke up feeling short of breath, not because of the dream, but because she knew he was real, and somehow, inexplicably, he was waiting for her. Kane Ward lived in a small town in the interior of Oregon, in an isolated house on the edge of a forest that seemed forgotten by time. I was 17, with eyes that changed color depending on the light of day and a sensitivity that made adults uncomfortable. He knew the train schedules by heart, the sound of every bird species in the region, and was able to identify when a storm was approaching even before the sky changed color. Since he was a child, he had nightmares about places he had never visited and people he had never seen. But one figure was constant, a woman with fair hair, intense eyes, and an expression of pain mixed with strength. In the last few months, the dreams have become more frequent, more vivid, and they always ended the same way. He woke up with the name Marlowe on the tip of his tongue without ever knowing why. That same morning, Kane received a letter, not in the mail, but left on the porch. The envelope was dry despite the rain from the night before, as if it had been placed there minutes ago. Inside was a note with just 2 lines. She's waking up. Take cover. JC. There was no return address, but he recognized the initials. Julian Crest, a name that had been appearing in old newspaper clippings that he found hidden around the house ever since his guardian, a reclusive man who raised him as if he were a laboratory experiment, had disappeared without a trace. Kane no longer wondered if his life was normal. He knew it wasn't. He knew that his body reacted too quickly to stimuli, that his memory was a sponge, and that his instincts screamed things that no one had taught him. But now, with that note and the feeling that something in the air had changed, he understood. The time for hiding was over. Marlowe, for her part, didn't yet know where Kane was, but her body seemed to know. She began to have lapses of consciousness. She would walk through the city and suddenly know which route to take even without a GPS, as if her brain had invisible trails pointing the way. Cassandra noticed it first. You're reacting to stimuli that you don't consciously recognize. This is typical of people who have had part of their cortex reinforced to store hidden sensory memory. They didn't want you to remember, but your body always finds a way. Based on the coordinates found in the letters and the clues scattered throughout Marlowe's dreams, the group decided to set off. Thatcher was in charge of security, Cassandra was in charge of logistics, and Bishop, as always, was in charge of sensing what the others couldn't see. The journey took them along forgotten roads, unnamed towns, and intersections that only existed in archived military records. Meanwhile, Kane left his house silently, without saying a word to anyone. He just took a backpack with documents, notebooks full of strange drawings, circles, codes, and a kind of map that he didn't remember drawing, and a flashlight. As he walked through the forest, he felt the ground vibrate beneath his feet, as if something underground was whispering with every step. For 2 days, Marlowe and Kane's paths grew closer, without them knowing it. In cheap motels and gas stations, the coincidences piled up. Clerks who said, "A boy like that came by yesterday." a hoodie left behind in a coffee shop that Marlowe recognized from her dream, the same smell of pine mixed with wet earth. Until finally, the meeting happened. In a village shrouded in fog, the two entered the same grocery store from opposite sides. When they saw each other, there was no surprise, just a thick silence, as if the entire world had held its breath. And then, without exchanging a word, they knew they were meant to be together. The reunion was silent, but absolutely clear. Marlowe and Kane looked at each other as if they knew everything they needed to know about each other. Not through words, but through an inexplicable, almost cellular familiarity. Cassandra watched them from afar, arms crossed, and murmured to Thatcher, "It's like the code has finally closed the loop." Thatcher just nodded, trying to keep her mind focused on what was yet to come. Marlowe approached Kane without hesitation. "Do you dream about me too?" she asked. He responded with a slight nod. "Since I was 8. There was no strangeness, no attempt to understand how that was possible. It was as if they had waited so long for this moment that any human logic would be insufficient. Bishop, as usual, sniffed Kane for a few seconds and then sat down next to him, silently approving of the new member of the group. That night, gathered in a hastily rented cabin, the four of them, Marlowe, Kane, Cassandra, and Thatcher, opened the last of Lena's documents. Among the sheets, one with a watermark caught their attention. It was a memo with an official Department of Defense stamp, dated 2003. At the top was a handwritten note. Protocol. Helix. Activation phase suspended. Risk of premature convergence between subjects H and C. Cassandra quickly translated, "They knew you two would meet, and they were afraid of it." Kane held the paper tightly, his jaw set. "Why?" he asked. "Because you, together, complete something you should never have allowed, autonomy. They wanted control, but you created connection." Thatcher, despite suspecting what was coming next, couldn't take her eyes off Marlowe's expression. There was no fear there anymore, only clarity. It was as if, at that moment, she had stopped being a variable and had become the main key to an equation that the government had spent years trying to hide. From then on, everything accelerated. With the pieces falling into place faster than they could process, the group hatched a plan: find the remaining facilities connected to Project Helix and destroy anything that could lead to the protocol's reactivation. Julian Crest, the scientist who appeared in newspaper clippings and was thought to be dead, appeared as the last piece of the puzzle. Cassandra had a lead. An old intelligence contact had mentioned a safe house in the North Carolina mountains where defecting researchers were hiding out under new identities. The journey would be risky, but there was no other choice. "If we find Crest, we will find the final answers," she said, as she marked the safest trail on the map. Marlowe watched the route layout with a strange sense of familiarity, as if it were already engraved in some dormant corner of his memory. On the road, Kane and Marlowe shared the back seat of an old van, with Thatcher driving and Cassandra holding a military radio on her lap, listening for interference. For hours, the two young people sat in silence until Marlowe broke the ice. "Do you ever feel when someone is lying?" Kane looked out the window, then back at her. "Always. Sometimes before they open their mouth." Marlowe smiled. "I thought it was just me." They began sharing small experiences, time lapses, unusual abilities, headaches in strong signal environments. The connection went beyond affinity. It was a kind of deep recognition, an identification that was impossible to fake. "I guess we're like opposite versions of the same thing," Marlowe said. "Like I'm the question and you're the answer." Kane nodded silently, and in that moment, they both knew, together, they would be stronger, but also more visible, and that could be very dangerous if the world found out too soon. If you've enjoyed this story so far, please like the video. It really helps us to continue bringing you content like this. The entrance to the mountain facility was virtually invisible, a clearing surrounded by tall trees, blanketed in snow, and with a single concrete structure rising from the ground like an ancient scar. Cassandra found the access point next to a rock marked with an inscription in Russian, a remnant of secret agreements between powers that swore they had no knowledge of the existence of Project Helix. The steel door opened with a sharp metallic clang, revealing a spiral staircase plunged into darkness. "This still has power," Thatcher commented, noticing the emergency lights on. The group descended in silence, the sound of footsteps echoing off the cold walls. Underground, narrow corridors and plaques with alphanumeric codes guided them through a maze of abandoned rooms. But one of them was different. A lit panel, a working terminal, and before him, a thin man with grey hair and sunken eyes who did not turn when the door opened. "Julian Crest?" Cassandra asked. The man nodded slowly, never taking his eyes off the screen. "You took your time." His voice was firm, but it carried decades of weariness. He finally turned and faced Marlowe and Kane. His eyes flickered for a second, as if he were seeing a living painting of something that only existed in the reports. "You survived, and worse, you awakened." Marlowe took a step forward. "We want to know why, and we want to end this." Crest took a deep breath, as if he had been waiting for this conversation for years. "Because you were created for a world that no longer exists. The project was intended to create perfect soldiers, but we discovered that the enhancement generated something unpredictable. Free will." Kane stepped closer. "What now?" The scientist looked at the panel, where a countdown timer blinked red. "Now it's your decision. The Helix protocol is active. If you don't deactivate it, everyone else will be hunted or activated as weapons." The counter on the panel read just under 48 hours. According to Crest, that was the time left until the system completed the last data synchronization and released the signal to any still active Rayon units, the clandestine cell that was hunting the Helix subjects. After that, all of you will be tracked and classified, targets or tools. There will be no in-between. Marlowe and Kane exchanged a silent look. This wasn't just about them. It was about the others, the ones still hiding, unaware of who they were. "How many of us are there?" Marlowe asked. Crest hesitated. 11, but only 3 have fully awakened so far. Cassandra approached the panel and assessed the commands. "This system has redundancy. Even if we destroy this terminal, there's another activation point somewhere." Crest nodded, indicating a map on the wall with red lines crossing mountains and states. "There are 3 main nodes. This is one of them. You need to shut down all 3, or this won't do any good." The group split up. Thatcher and Bishop would go with Cassandra to the second facility, hidden in a decommissioned base in Colorado. Marlowe and Kane would head to the third point, further south, on private land surrounded by an old military reservation. "If you can't shut down all the points at the same time, the system will restart," Crest warned. "It has to be coordinated." Before they left, Marlowe turned to the scientist. "Why did you make me like this?" He took a moment to answer. "Because I thought the world needed better people, but I was wrong. What I did to you, to all of you, wasn't science. It was arrogance." Marlowe just nodded with a strange serenity. "So now, it's our turn to fix it." She and Kane left the room without looking back. For the first time, control was not in the hands of the one who created it, but of the one who chose to continue it. The mission required precision. Marlowe and Kane drove for hours along narrow, poorly lit trails, passing areas marked by rusty signs and old, half-open military gates. The place looked as if it had been abandoned in a hurry, as if its secrets had been buried along with any trace of humanity. When they reached the entrance to the southern installation, they encountered resistance. 2 armed men, clearly mercenaries working for some group that still profited from the Helix Trail, were patrolling the entrance. Marlowe watched the movement in silence, analyzing the patterns with unusual clarity. They repeat the same route every 4 minutes. They change positions, but always with a gap on the west side. Kane understood the message without her having to elaborate. They waited for the right moment, counted the seconds, and acted with the precision of someone who had been trained without knowing it. They disarmed the guards, entered, and locked the door from the inside. There was no fuss, only efficiency, something that frightened even them. Inside, the air was thick, as if the hallways held memories. The walls were covered in blacked-out panels, but a few lights still flickered on standby. In the center of one of the rooms, they found the terminal. It was identical to the one in the previous base. Same layout, same interface, same countdown timer, now showing 12 hours. Kane plugged in the lockout device Cassandra had created, while Marlowe scanned the remaining files. That was when she found something unexpected. A list. Names, dates, approximate locations. The others. She pulled out the paper, scanned it quickly, and stopped at one point. "There's a 9-year-old girl. She's alive, in Kansas." Kane looked at her. "When this is all over, we'll go after her." Marlowe nodded. For the first time, she didn't feel anger. She felt purpose, and a burning need to make sure no child grew up with the void she had to fill alone. While Marlowe and Kane completed their mission in the south, Cassandra and Thatcher faced a worst-case scenario in Colorado. The facility was under surveillance by autonomous drones, outdated military technology used exclusively by private groups with access to off-the-books funding. To avoid detection, they hid for hours in an abandoned warehouse near the Sakya perimeter, waiting for nightfall. Bishop, lying beside Thatcher, seemed restless. He sniffed the wind, as if sensing something more dangerous than machinery. Cassandra, watching the drones through thermal binoculars, muttered, "They know we're here. They just don't know when we'll make a move." When the temperature dropped enough to dim the sensor's visibility, the two moved quickly. They entered through the back, cutting through an old grate, and moving through dark hallways where the silence of abandonment competed with the tension of time. Upon reaching the central room, they found the last terminal. It wasn't activated yet, but the logs showed that someone had accessed the system recently. "Someone tried to interrupt the protocol and failed," Cassandra said, reading the logs. The counter on that terminal was only showing 3 hours. Bishop began to bark, a dry, short sound. It wasn't an alarm, it was a warning. Thatcher drew his gun, but Cassandra raised her hand. "If we shoot, we'll trigger the protocol early. We have to do this cleanly." Using the sequence sent by Crest, they began the shutdown process. They needed to enter codes in sync with the other points. Cassandra activated the communicator. "Marlowe, Kane, we're ready. When you give the signal, we'll start here." The answer came in Marlowe's firm voice. 30 seconds. Get ready." On the other end of the line, for a brief moment, everyone understood the gravity of the moment. Everything they had lived through, everything they had lost, was about to become a choice. For the first time, the synchronized countdown began. At 3 different facilities, hundreds of miles apart, 4 people and a dog acted as one, as if they had been programmed to do so. But the difference was clear. Now they were choosing. Marlowe typed in commands with near-automatic precision, while Kane monitored the system's stability. With each keystroke, the panel responded with green lights, confirming that the shutdown was in progress. In Colorado, Cassandra did the same. Thatcher watched the doors closely, ready to act if something went wrong. When the counter reached 0005, all 3 terminals emitted a sharp beep and then silence. Absolute silence, as if even the power cables had stopped pulsing. The system had finally been taken down. There was no more tracking, there was no more activation. Project Helix was over, but not everyone was relieved. As Marlowe walked away from the terminal, she felt a slight pressure in her chest. It wasn't pain, it was something different, like a frequency had been abruptly cut. Kane noticed and grabbed her arm. "Are you okay?" She nodded, but she looked dazed. It was like something inside stopped screaming. Cassandra, on the other end of the comm, heard and replied, "It could be the neural connection trace. The last synapse between you and the system's core has been severed." Marlowe closed her eyes for a moment. She felt relief, but also mourning, like she had said goodbye to a part of herself. When she opened her eyes, she smiled softly, wearily. "We're just people now." Kane smiled back. people who survived. Outside, the sun was beginning to rise, and for the first time since this had all started, this group didn't feel like they had to run. The danger was still there, but control, after all, was theirs. Over the next few days, the group split up temporarily. Marlowe and Kane returned to the cabin in Oregon, taking with them the systems saved. Records, names, locations, activation patterns. Their mission now was different, to find the remaining Helix subjects and give them what they had never had: information, freedom, and choice. Cassandra headed east with Bishop, searching for an old contact who could help them erase the project's digital footprint. Thatcher returned to Ohio. He needed to reconnect with his life before the storm, even though he knew nothing would ever be the same again. He spent days in silence, organizing personal files and rereading old war letters. In one of them, written by Hollis, there was a sentence that seemed to have stood still in time. "If I ever don't come back, find what I left unfinished. Someone will need it." Now he understood, Hollis knew. Somehow he knew that Marlowe would exist and that one day he would need help. At the cabin, Marlowe spent her days on long walks through the woods, sometimes in silence, other times telling Kane fragments of memories that kept surfacing. "I remember a room with white light, voices saying my name in several languages, and a hand squeezing mine, telling me everything would be okay." Kane listened without interrupting. He shared his own flashes with her. The image of a woman with short hair singing to him in another language, the sensation of floating in a tank, the eyes of the scientist watching him from afar, silently recording everything. They didn't talk about revenge or justice, only about understanding, about healing what they had inherited, even without asking. And in each conversation, they created something new, a story that didn't come from the project, but from the real life they were finally building together. A few weeks later, unexpected news arrived. Cassandra had managed to track unusual activity on the server that housed part of the Helix files. Someone had tried to restore the system's backup from a location in Mexico. It was a remnant rayon cell, smaller, more disorganized, but still dangerous. "They want to pick up where they left off," she explained over a video call. "They're trying to gather enough data to independently reactivate the protocol." Marlowe listened quietly. This didn't surprise her. Taking down a structure didn't destroy the desire for power that had created it. "We're going to stop them," she said, "but without becoming what they wanted us to be." The plan was no longer just to survive, it was to protect others, to ensure that no Helix was captured or used. Thatcher, upon hearing of the threat, didn't hesitate. She requested a transfer to an international security division where she could act legally but discreetly against networks like Rayon. The war was still going on, it just had changed form. One cold night, Marlowe woke up scared. She had dreamed of the little girl from Kansas. She saw her being taken away by men in white, crying silently, holding a blue notebook with drawings of animals. When she woke up, she knew it wasn't just a dream. It was a calling. She and Kane prepared everything in 2 days. Cassandra sent the most recent coordinates and got fake documents to facilitate entry into the state. When they arrived in the city, they pretended to be social workers investigating reports of abuse. The child, named Ellie, was found in a simple house under the care of a strange man who claimed to be her great-uncle. With one look, Marlowe recognized the same emptiness in the girl's eyes, the same one she had when she was 7. Ellie didn't say anything, just held Marlowe's hand tightly. She didn't need to say anything. She knew who had come to get her. The decision to take Ellie with them wasn't an easy one, not legally, but emotionally. Marlowe knew the weight of tearing someone away from the only environment they knew, even if that environment was toxic. "She'll wake up little by little," she told Kane, as she watched the girl sleep in the back seat of the car. "And when she does, there needs to be someone there to explain to her that she's not a mistake, that she's not alone." Kane understood more than anyone. He'd felt the fear of being found out, the terror of thinking that something inside him was a factory defect. When Ellie woke up in the morning, she didn't ask where they were. She just pointed to a tree and said, as if it were the most ordinary thing in the world, "There's a camera over there, but it's broken." Marlowe and Kane looked at each other. Ellie was already starting to notice in her own way. Back at the cabin, Ellie settled in with surprising ease. She was quiet but observant. She copied gestures, memorized escape routes, and once corrected a code error Kane was writing into one of the protection systems. "How did you know?" he asked, surprised. She just shrugged. "I dreamed about it yesterday." Little by little, she began to open up. She drew maps, scribbled faces of people no one knew, and asked questions about things she'd never seen, like drones, synthetic fibers, and thermal sensors. Marlowe let her be, free but present, never intruding, just following. "You don't have to understand everything right now," she'd say. "You just need to know that there are people with you now." Ellie still slept with the blue notebook clutched to her chest. It was her only link to the past. But in the last few days, she'd started to put it aside in the morning, as if to say, what comes next might be better than what's left. Meanwhile, Cassandra gathered the few trusted allies she still had in the system. People who, like her, had abandoned their roles when they realized what kind of experiment they were helping to sustain. With their help, she began to build a parallel network of protection, secure identities, temporary shelters, alternative routes. "It's not an organization," she said. "It's a shield." The idea was simple. Each helix they found would be taken to a neutral point where they could decide their own path. There was no training, no commands, no hierarchies. It was about autonomy and freedom. Thatcher, now acting as a field agent, began to receive regular reports from Cassandra and used her position to discreetly interfere with suspicious operations. In one of the reports, she found the name of a new potential target, a 16-year-old girl in Nevada with a history of memory blackouts and advanced arithmetic abilities. "Another piece of the puzzle," she told Cassandra, "and another chance to get it right." Back at the cabin, Kane was installing a makeshift antenna on the roof when Ellie appeared with an unexpected question. "Why were we made differently?" He stopped, thought, and answered sincerely, "Because someone thought they could control the future, but they forgot that we wanted to live our own." Ellie seemed satisfied with the answer. Marlowe, who was listening from the balcony, smiled. That was it. It no longer mattered how they were born, who raised them, or what was expected of them. What mattered was what they were choosing to do with it now. In the evening, the three of them sat together in front of the fireplace. Ellie fell asleep with her head on Marlowe's lap. Kane watched the flames, silent. And there, in that simple moment, they were not the results of an experiment. They were a family, imperfect, rebuilt, and finally free. A few days later, a coded message arrived at the security terminal Kane was monitoring. It came from a masked address, but the pattern was familiar. Marlowe recognized the structure immediately. It was from Lena, or at least something she had programmed to trigger if certain keywords were triggered. The message was short but clear. "If you're reading this, it means you've chosen to live. So listen carefully. There are more, and they're coming for them." Attached to it was a database of coordinates for possible helix remnants, stored in encrypted backups that had escaped the initial destruction. The shock wasn't knowing there were more. Everyone had suspected that. The shock was knowing someone was still hunting. "Rayon isn't dead," Kane said, his jaw clenched. "It's just quieter." Cassandra confirmed the information a short time later. Mercenary movement had been detected in 2 of the locations on the list, one in Idaho, the other in Honduras. It was at that moment that Marlowe made a decision. "We're going to go on the defensive." Until then, the group had limited itself to covering their tracks, hiding survivors, and trying to remain invisible. But that was no longer enough. "If they're still hunting, we're going to hunt them back." The idea was not war, but active protection, creating a network of interception, rapid response, and real presence in places where other Helix might be. To do that, they needed more people. And to get more people, they needed the truth. For the first time, Marlowe considered something that had previously seemed unthinkable, revealing part of the story to the world. Not all of it, of course, but enough to create public pressure, dismantle Rayon's branches, and attract outside attention. They've always counted on our silence. Maybe it's time to make some noise. Kane, beside her, just nodded. They were no longer just survivors. Now, they were the ones deciding what to do next. The strategy began with anonymous leaks to security blogs and forums specializing in government surveillance. Cassandra used her network to distribute parts of the story, experiments on humans, data erased from official records, and hints of involvement by former intelligence agency employees, all without naming names but enough to create discomfort. Within a week, the buzz grew. Independent podcasts began discussing the genetically modified humans the government erased from history. The mainstream media still ignored it, but those who knew where to look were already paying attention. An investigative journalist with a history of breaking military stories contacted him. Cassandra quietly probed him. "Are you prepared to learn something that will change your life and possibly put it at risk?" he asked. He didn't hesitate. "I've lived with less." Marlowe, upon hearing this, agreed to attend a meeting, but he made it clear. "We don't want fame. We want security, and a chance to prevent this from happening again." The meeting took place in a remote coffee shop on the border between two states. Marlowe arrived wearing a cap and sunglasses, accompanied by Kane. The journalist, Oliver Brandt, had a tired but attentive look and a way of listening that made it clear. He wasn't there for the headlines, he was there for the truth. Marlowe told parts of the story, showing documents, archive photos, maps, and excerpts from Lena's letters. Oliver recorded everything on audio with her consent and asked few questions. When he finished, he simply said, "This needs to be told, but carefully." They agreed on a series of security measures, pseudonyms, and heavy encryption. Marlowe left the coffee shop with her heart racing. For the first time, part of the truth would emerge from the shadows, and at the same time, the feeling of exposure grew. "Do you trust him?" Kane asked. Marlowe answered without hesitation, "No, but I trust what he's going to do with it." The publication came out 2 weeks later with the subtle title, "Codes of Silence: What the Government Hid in the Helix Project." It wasn't a direct accusation, but a narrative stitched together with anonymous testimonies, partial evidence, and uncomfortable questions, enough to attract attention and put Rayon on alert. Behind the scenes, Marlowe followed everything. She didn't appear publicly, but she read every comment, every analysis, every attempt to discredit the article. What surprised her most was the number of people who said they could relate, people who described similar symptoms, fragmented memories, stories of families who moved to another city without explanation. "We lit a light that won't go out easily," said Kane, as she monitored the accesses to the encrypted forum created for the remaining Helix members. In less than 48 hours, 5 new people appeared there. None of them asked for explanations. They were all looking for something in common: belonging. Among these new names, one stood out: Milo Vega, a 21-year-old who claimed to be able to see patterns of behavior with mathematical precision. He had never heard of Helix before the story, but when he read it, he felt as if someone had written about his life. Cassandra contacted him and confirmed her suspicions. Deleted files from a shelter in Los Angeles indicated that he had disappeared for 2 years as a child. "Do you want to know who made you?" Marlowe asked when she met him. Milo shrugged. "Maybe, but what I really want is to know what I can do with what was done to me." That was it. These young men didn't want revenge. They wanted meaning. Marlowe watched them with a mix of hope and caution. She knew that not all of them were ready, but some were. And for them, she had a proposal. "Let's create something of our own, not an organization, a network, a way to make sure that no one ever wakes up not knowing who they are again. The network was given the symbolic name Line 23, after Marlowe's number in the original Project Helix database. Milo had suggested it. It's simple, but it reminds us of where we came from and why we're still here. Line 23 started small, with just 8 members. Each had a different skill set, a fractured past, and an urgent need to be part of something that didn't involve manipulation or control. Meetings were conducted via encrypted calls, with rotating locations and code-defined pseudonyms. There was no fixed leadership, but Marlowe was clearly the center of trust, not by authority, but by presence. Ellie, now more talkative and confident, attended the meetings as if she were part of the rank and file. Kane taught her to code, while Marlowe taught her to trust. "You may feel scared," she said, "but you will never feel alone again." At one of these meetings, Milo presented a pattern he had been observing in the data shared across the network. The remnants are not just scattered. They have been grouped by cognitive profiles. Each group has complementary functions, as if we were pieces of a larger project. Cassandra, upon hearing this, fell silent for a few seconds. They were building a living intelligence, a collective organism based on people. The revelation dropped like a bombshell. Marlowe immediately understood the risk. If someone tried to gather all the helix with this pattern in mind, the result would not only be dangerous, it would be irreversible. We need to find the last ones before they find us. But it wasn't just about protecting, it was about explaining. Marlowe began sending coded messages to the new possible helix with a single opening sentence. "Do you feel like you belong somewhere else? Maybe that's because you do." Most responded. Some ran away, but everyone understood somehow that this was not an illusion, it was a calling. As the months passed, Line 23 grew, not in quantity but in structure. Small groups began to form in different cities, connected by their own protocols, but all guided by the same principles: freedom, anonymity, and mutual support. Marlowe insisted on one rule: nobody orders anyone else around. Everyone chooses how much they want to know and how much they want to participate. Kane helped with the technical side, and Ellie, now 10, amazed everyone with her ability to understand code as if she were reading poetry. Despite everything, life was beginning to take shape. There were birthdays celebrated discreetly, walks in the nearby forests, entire afternoons just looking at the sky. But the weight of the origin never completely disappeared. On certain days, all it took was news of movement from Rayon or prolonged silence from a member of the network for the tension to return. "We're getting better," Marlowe said, "but we are not safe yet." It was during one of those silent days that an unexpected message arrived. One of the members of Line 23, codenamed Haven, reported that a new type of tracking had been detected. It wasn't satellite-based or GPS-based. It was biological, a low-frequency pulse transmitted by implanted components at the cellular level. "This is what I've felt since I was a kid," Milo said, "like someone always knew where I was." Cassandra confirmed the possibility. The original Helix protocol wasn't just an external control system. They implemented internal traits, marks that can only be deactivated with a specific genetic sequence. Marlowe felt the ground give way. So even with the system down, they can still find us. The revelation changed everything. Taking down the system was one step, but true freedom would require something deeper, finding and deactivating the core from which it all began. The place where the first sequence was generated, where Marlowe, Kane, and so many others stopped being just human. Cassandra located the possible origin of the core in an old, decommissioned military laboratory nestled in the mountains of North Carolina, the same place where, months earlier, they had found Julian Crest. But there was one part of the complex they hadn't explored, a sublevel that appeared on only one of the technical maps and that required a specific type of biometric access. "Maybe even Crest wouldn't be able to get in," Kane commented as they prepared their equipment. Marlowe knew what that meant. That was where his story began, and maybe where I could finally end it. With the support of Line 23, they set up a silent operation without heavy weaponry, but with everything they had learned since they awakened: pattern reading, adaptive cryptography, and above all, absolute trust in each other. Bishop, now older, still accompanied them, as if he knew that this was his last mission. Entry to the sub-level required 2 simultaneous accesses, 1 ocular and 1 fingerprint. When she placed her hand on the panel, Marlowe saw the green light come on. The system still recognized her. That confirmed what she had already suspected. This place had not only created her, but was still waiting for her. The group descended in silence to a circular room, in the center of which was an old terminal surrounded by switched-off monitors. On the ceiling, a sealed capsule with wires connected to a metal structure on the floor. Kane activated the monitors. What they saw there silenced them for minutes. They were videos, testing sessions, children in containment tanks, voices giving commands, behavioral data. A graph showed the first 23 subjects, 22 archived, 1 active, code MRL. Marlowe took a deep breath. It was all about me. Kane took her hand. And now it's going to be about you. She nodded, and with a simple command, she typed the final sequence. It was time to erase the root. As the system began to shut down, a string of messages appeared on the monitors. Redundancy. Failure. Primary core shutdown. Helix protocol permanently terminated. The lights in the room flickered, and for a moment there was complete silence. Not the tense silence of before, but a complete silence, one of closure. Marlowe took a few steps back, staring at the terminal as if she had buried a part of herself there. There was no celebration, no immediate relief. There was heaviness, a heaviness that might take years to lift, but now it was in the right hands. Kane hugged Marlowe from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder. "You did it." She didn't respond right away. She just closed her eyes. For the first time, the internal scream that had been with her since childhood had stopped. Outside the facility, the sky was beginning to change colors. It was late afternoon, but to them it felt like the beginning of everything. When they returned to the cabin, they were greeted with silent stares. Cassandra, Milo, Ellie, they were all there. Bishop, even though he was tired, ran to Marlowe and lay down at her feet, as if to say that now he could rest. News of the core shutdown spread quickly throughout Line 23. The remaining traces of Rayon began to disappear. Some were arrested, others disappeared into anonymity. But the project, the real project, was over. Marlowe called one last general meeting of the network. "We are no longer targets, nor experiments. We are people, and that is more than enough." Many cried, others smiled silently. Ellie held a candle in her hands, and before anyone could say anything, she whispered, "Now we exist, right?" Marlowe knelt before her. "Now we choose to exist." There was no party that night. He had something rarer, peace, and a sense of belonging that no protocol in the world could simulate. In the months that followed, Line 23 evolved into something organic, not an organization, not a resistance, but a community. Each member chose how much they wanted to be present, and how. Some went their own way, rebuilding lives far from the traces, left by the science that had shaped them. Others reached out, helping to locate survivors, erasing traces, creating new escape routes for anyone who needed to start over. Marlowe kept the cabin as a reference point, a place of passage, of pause, of healing. It wasn't a base, it was a temporary home. Kane, by her side, took care of the invisible parts of things, the systems, the contacts, the digital barriers. Ellie grew up in freedom, without protocol, without tests, without expectations, just living. And little by little, she became not only part of the new story, but the greatest proof that a new story was possible. Sometimes Marlowe still dreamed of the lab, of the capsule, of the data streaming across the screens. But in her dreams, she was no longer trapped. She watched, she chose, and when she woke, she felt something she had never felt before: lightness. She knew that not all her traumas would go away. She knew that the past could not be erased like a code, but now she carried that past with a new meaning. It no longer defined who she was. It was simply the road that had brought her here. Sometimes she would sit outside the cabin, Bishop lying beside her, watching the sunset through the trees. Silently, she would think of Lena, of Hollis, of those who had gone and those who would come. And when Ellie came running down the dirt path, laughing at something only she understood, Marlowe would smile. Because in the end, that was it. It wasn't about what they had done to her. It was about what she had chosen to do with it. Comment below what you would do in Marlowe's place. The dilemma is very real. One morning, Marlowe received a letter with no return address. There was no stamp, no signature, just a folded sheet of paper with a handwritten note. You were created to survive, but you chose to live. No one can program that. It wasn't hard to guess who it came from. Julian Crest had disappeared after the core was shut down, leaving no trace. But this message was the goodbye he'd never had the courage to say in person. Marlowe read it silently and put the sheet in a box with his mother's letters, not out of nostalgia for the past, but out of respect for the journey. Time passed slowly here, and that was good. It meant there was no urgency anymore, that no one was rushing, that everything was, for once, moving at its right pace. Ellie was helping Kane in the garden, asking about bugs and algorithms as if they were part of the same subject. Marlowe watched them with the kind of love that needs no explanation. It just happens. And then, one afternoon, Marlowe climbed to the top of the hill behind the cabin, alone. She sat on a rock she used as a lookout and stared out at the horizon. She didn't look for signs. She didn't wait for answers. She just watched. Because now she knew. She knew who she was. She knew what they had tried to do to her. And most of all, she knew what she had built from it. The call girl, the protocol woman, the unstable, variable, they were all part of it. But none of those definitions had survived what she had chosen to be: human, uncontrollable, imperfect, free. When she stood up and walked back toward the house, the sky was beginning to change color. It was the end of another day. But for Marlowe, it was still just the beginning. If this story touched you, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next chapter.